So we've covered actually a lot of different kinds of generating power so far. We talked about petroleum, we talked about natural gas, we talked about coal, we've talked about solar, we've talked about wind, we talked about hydrogen fuel cells as an energy storage solution for those intermittent renewables. So what's next? We're going to talk about hydropower. And we've been using hydropower for quite some time. So right away, I just want to point out hydrogen fuel cells and hydropower, different things, right? Hydrogen fuel cells is specifically talking about that kind of chemical reaction with the electrons flowing through the wires and forming water at the end. Hydropower is talking about using flowing water through, say, a dam or from a river in order to turn gears, in order to get electricity. So that's a pretty good opener right there. Hydropower, the use of kinetic energy, the energy of motion, falling or flowing water to generate electricity. It is the same principle between old mill wheels and also modern power dams. So here, this is an old-fashioned mill wheel, right? An old water wheel. The river just runs past, and as the water is flowing downhill, the way water does, it's going to be pushing these paddles on the mill wheel, which forces it to rotate counterclockwise here. And then that counterclockwise rotation is going to drive all the gears inside this mill, which then allows them to grind the flour or corn or whatever kind of cereal grain that they are grinding up at the moment. And that's how a water wheel works, right? They're harnessing energy, they're harnessing power from the flowing water. Well, modern hydroelectric dams use pretty much the same principle. The design is just a little bit more complicated. There's also such a thing as micro hydropower, which I'll show you in a bit, which involves portable floating turbines that can be used in a stream or river for power without altering the environment too much. All right. So here is a modern hydroelectric power dam right here. What you do is you find an area of landscape where there's a river flowing through it, where if you were to build a concrete wall going through some sort of pinch point in that landscape, that the water from the river would just continue to fill up and fill up and fill up. So you're in downstream of some sort of floodplain, and all of the water in that floodplain would have to go through some passage between, say, two hills. And if you find that, that's a good place where you could put a dam, and then all of the area behind the dam gets filled up with water to create a reservoir, a man-made artificial lake. Now, that water level is going to rise up higher and higher and higher, and every foot that water is raised up is adding more and more potential energy to that water. And you allow the water to flow back downhill the way it already wants to flow, but you make it do work on the way through. You make it spin turbines, of course. Spinning turbines is going to be how this works. Hydropower results from the force of water flowing through a dam. Hydropower provides 17% of the world's electricity supply. Let's click on this map of dams here. It looks like they may have updated the website and removed the link to the actual map, but they have Excel documents listing all of the dams in North America. So let's take a look at that and give you an idea of how many dams exist in North America. Here's the list that is all contained inside Canada. Pretty long. We're in the high numbers here. Okay, there's like over 200 dams in Canada. Another 120 some in Mexico. United States is starting at 328 here. And ends at, oh my goodness. So there's a couple thousand dams in the United States. Let's see here. That's like 1,900 dams in there. Quite a few. There's quite a few dams. So maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that it provides 17% of the world's electricity supply. This does not have the same problem as the other renewable energy sources in that water flows downhill at night just as well as it does during the day, and it doesn't matter if the wind's blowing or anything like that. It is a renewable energy source because as long as the sun keeps shining, water will continue to evaporate. It will rain uphill, and that will capture more and more water up in this dam, and that will continue to flow downhill. However, as I mentioned really early on in this course, just because something's renewable doesn't mean it's inexhaustible. We could try to generate so much electricity from this dam. In order to generate more electricity, we would have to allow more water to flow through to get more power. We would eventually deplete all of the reservoir, and we could use it faster than it's able to be filled back up. So, we can't get unlimited power from this, but we can get quite a lot. This is a cross-section of a dam, how they kind of work. And you'll notice that they're a lot thicker at the bottom than they seem to be at the top. They're very sturdy structures. They have to be because of all that water pressure pushing against them. And the way that dams work is that they have a water intake that allows the water from the stream to come in, and you always want to make sure that the reservoir's water line is above that water intake, because otherwise you're not going to be getting the power out of your dam that you want. So you want to make sure that there's at least that much water in there, and if there's not, you need to decrease the amount that you're allowing to flow through the dam. So the water comes through, and as it's flowing through, it spins this big old gear, this big rotor. And that, of course, what else would it do? Spins a turbine, and that generates electricity, and then it flows on back out. So much like all the other forms of electricity production that we discussed, it comes down to spinning a turbine. And similar to any other forms of power that we discussed, dams come with their own baggage, their own issues that they present. So since the stream, the river, comes from the entire watershed uphill, right? And all the rain that hits that entire watershed is going to be carrying all of the sediment and dirt and silt and dust and stuff from all the surrounding landscape to the river. And the river is going to flow towards the dam, but the dam's there to prevent the flow of water, and only the water at the very top is ever allowed to flow through the dam. That means more and more sediment is going to keep building up and building up and building up at the bottom of that dam, at the base of it. So it starts filling up with fine sediments. That can create a lot of pressure on the dam itself, and the more and more weight that gets forced on it, the stronger the dam would need to be. And eventually you can get so much sediment pushing up against it that it can put strain on the dam, and you start to get cracks beginning to form. The dam could actually collapse because of too much pressure from sediments pushing against it. The other problem associated with these sediments is they contain a lot of organic matter. They contain leaf litter and organic matter from the soil and little bits of dead animals, that sort of thing. And that would normally be delivered into aquatic food chains and serve as kind of food and this sort of thing, but it's just kind of building up at the deep, cold waters below this dam. And what happens is they just kind of rot back there. You just have all this rotting organic matter built up behind the dam, and that releases a lot of greenhouse gases. In particular, releases a lot of methane, which is, again, 23 times more powerful than carbon dioxide is. So dams actually do, like hydropower, even though you think of it as a green energy source, it actually does release a lot of carbon dioxide and CO and methane emissions along with it, because over time they build up more and more and more sediment. Now, the solution to that is to dredge the area behind the dam to kind of scoop it all out. But that is a ridiculously expensive process, requiring very specialized machinery, and we have a way of humans of just kind of putting off things that don't seem like an immediate pressing concern. If it's not a catastrophe that's about to be an issue, we can always put it off till next year. So a lot of these dams have huge amounts of sediments built up behind them, and they're releasing a lot of CO2 and methane, and they are losing structural integrity, and we actually don't have enough inspectors to verify that they're in good repair going around the United States to make sure that they're not going to burst at any time. And in many cases, we just don't have the funding available or the political willpower to deal with these problems before they become a major issue. We genuinely need to divert more funding to infrastructure. And most politicians agree with that. Like, regardless of what side of the aisle they happen to be standing on, most politicians agree that we need more infrastructure spending. However, it's a lot easier to drum up support for new projects than it is for maintenance. Nevertheless, we do need to maintain our existing infrastructure. So, what else? What are some other issues with dams? Well, you may have noticed that I said that the way that we build dams is that we create artificial reservoirs. We look for a point in the landscape in a watershed where all the water has to flow through a particular area between, say, two hills. We build the dam there so that the entire landscape fills up with water. That means that we have just taken a habitat that was of one type and we converted it to an artificial lake. We just flooded a massive area of habitat. So yeah, dams create a lot of habitat destruction just by virtue of putting them in. We fundamentally are altering the landscape by creating these artificial lakes there. It also alters the dynamics of the water system because the water was flowing down through this river and now we are controlling the flow of the water. And it prevents fish from being able to swim upstream. And, so for example, salmon, they spend their adult lives in marine ecosystems in saltwater, and then they go back to the stream where they were born in order to reproduce. So they swim back upstream to get to their spawning grounds, and then they reproduce and die, and then the next generation of salmon make their way down the river in order to live their lives as adults, and then they come back. Well, if there's a giant dam in your way, you can't really get back up to the spawning grounds. So that means that their reproductive rates are going to be decreased pretty substantially. Now, consider how much people like eating salmon, and particularly wild salmon, and other types of fish, as a matter of fact. And think about how much food that this would make available for other ecosystems. Like, you've probably seen videos of bears eating salmon as they come out of the water, and imagine how much food is available from all these little salmon fry, that's what baby fish are called, swimming downstream, right? And a lot of animals are going to get their meals there. So not only does this disrupt the whole ecosystem, it also disrupts an entire industry, a food industry, as a result, not just for salmon, but for other fish as well. So that is a big concern, not only for environmentalists, but for industry. Now, there are solutions to this. For example, some dams have fish ladders built into them, which is a series of pools that are kind of arranged like steps. And so the salmon can jump into each pool over and over again, just like the same way they would kind of hop uphill. And they've been constructed in such a way that they can deliver the salmon eventually up to the top of where the dam is, and they can get into the river that way and be able to kind of mirror their natural ecology. This is a video of something called a salmon cannon, where what they do is they put the end of this tube down in the water. It has kind of a low pressure system inside of it, like a vacuum. The fish can kind of swim into it, and then on the top end, it just fires the fish right out towards the top. So that's humans are creative. We're problem solvers. That's kind of our defining characteristic as an animal. So that's one possibility. Now, another issue that you get with dams is that sometimes they overflow and all those sediments actually do start coming out all at once. So downstream areas can be flooded with sediment. So you can take a look at this satellite photo here, and you can see all the mud and sediment and nasty stuff that is pouring through this entire system. That's because one dam overflowed and all the sediments kind of escaped out. Yeah, there are some environmental problems associated with dams and hydroelectric power plants. So let's talk about those greenhouse gases emitted by dams. Organic sediments trapped behind dams rot instead of being delivered to downstream food webs. The world's largest dams emit 104 million metric tons of methane annually, according to Brazil's National Institute for Space Research. This implies that dam methane emissions are responsible for about 4% of the total warming impact of human activities. Now, hydropower with dams is usually what we mean when we talk about hydropower, but people have come up with some other ideas for how to get water to power some devices. So what about tidal power? The tides come in and they come out over and over and over again, and as long as the moon keeps tugging on the ocean, that's going to continue to be true. So what if we could get energy from the flow of the tides moving in and out? So we have these submerged little devices here, which spin as the water's flowing in and flowing out and flowing in and flowing out. And this might be a clean, renewable energy source, but it's new. So the environmental impacts have not been evaluated. And in general, it is difficult to design equipment that stays under water, particularly under salt water, for extended periods of time. Salt water is pretty corrosive. Organic living things tend to grow on top of it, like algae will get into it, and little crustaceans, things like that, barnacles. It would be hard to say how long a device like this would actually be able to last. There's also little ones that could go into streams, but you would not get a lot of charge out of those, and you'd have to pull them back in periodically. So there's other options, but they're kind of experimental. So we have two more renewables to talk about, biomass and geothermal. So let's talk about biomass. Biomass is any kind of material that comes from living things, more directly from living things than, say, fossil fuels did. And typically you burn it. This is a pretty diverse category. So up here in the upper left, I have these cows, and you see these patties behind them on the wall. These are produced by the cows. These are cow droppings that have been worked into patties, which are going to be left to dry and then burned as a source of fuel, as a source of cooking energy. So those are called uklas. We also have charcoal, right, which is a wood byproduct. We have wood itself, just firewood, right? That is a form of biomass energy. And then we can also make fuels like gasoline type fuels directly from plant-based materials. You can actually take used vegetable oil, like say McDonald's has been using their fries. They've been making fries all day, so they have this used oil in that deep fryer. You could take that, run through a filter a few times. Typically, there's some other chemical modifications that you could make in order to make sure that your engine doesn't get mucked up in the process. But technically, you could take that and run through a diesel engine, and it will burn and run that diesel engine. So simple products that you don't need to go to fossil fuels, we could just make from available crops that we have, could be used in a gasoline type fuel. So that's another way that we could get biomass fuels. And incidentally, as a bonus, your car exhaust will smell like French fries. Not a joke, it really will. So like I said, with a few more chemical enhancements, you run it through a few different processes, you can convert some of that plant matter into what we call biodiesel. And this you'd be able to run through your engine over and over again, and it would burn just like diesel gas does. And it has some advantages over diesel. For example, biofuels can be grown just about anywhere. Right? There's not a finite number of them. We can just keep growing it and keep growing it and keep growing it and keep growing it, so there's not a limited supply like we have for petroleum. If used sustainably, there would actually be no overall increase of CO2 gas. And why would that be? Well, the CO2 that is created by the biodiesel being burned would then be recaptured when we grow new crops, because photosynthesis takes CO2 out of the air and then locks that carbon into the plant's matter, into its leaves and its stem and its sugars and all of that when it's growing. Every single atom of carbon that is inside that biofuel had to be captured from the atmosphere in the first place. So in order to get the same crops back, we are going to need to pull the same amount of CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And it would be very easy to transport, to store and transport, especially in cars. Currently, we don't really use biofuels a lot of places. Some people have make their own. They have set up their engine to run on biofuel, which basically means they just had a clean diesel engine, and then they started exclusively putting biodiesel into it. As I understand it, if you have a diesel engine that was already running on regular diesel, it can build up some deposits in it, and then if you try to run biodiesel through it, they can kind of come loose and it can end up clogging up some things. So you want to start with fresh diesel. But that is pretty uncommon. But what we do is we add ethanol into gasoline, and that comes from corn products. We make ethanol from corn. So we already a little bit put this idea into practice, but we could make more gasoline-type products strictly from plant materials. And in Pennsylvania, we have something called the Alternative Fuels Incentive Grant Program, which actually stipulates that a small percentage, about 2% of diesel gas sold should contain biodiesel. 2% of the blend should be biodiesel, and there are stipulations for that amount to increase when certain conditions are met. So we might be actually moving a little bit in that direction.
So right now there's actually a conversation happening about whether or not to lift a ban on what's called E15 fuel, which is 15% ethanol. Currently our blend is 10% ethanol. And the reason is because gas prices have gone so high that increasing the amount of the gas that is ethanol would decrease the overall price, because the price of ethanol is less than the price of gasoline. Now, there is some concern that I've seen from like mechanics, car guys, people who are really into engines and fuel blends, probably know a lot more about it than I do personally, that more ethanol might increase the corrosion of plastic and rubber parts, and that it also might reduce the total miles per gallon. So while you're getting cheaper gas, you're getting fewer miles for it. I am looking, and if I find any, I'll let you know. I haven't found any scientific papers that have a conclusive statement about this that can make an actual definitive call, say, yes, this would be overall better or worse. But this information is currently part of the national conversation concerning fuel usage. So it's good to know where the ethanol comes from and why it's being added into the gasoline supply.